Hello, welcome to the study session for the CYSA CS0002. Let's begin with Domain 1, Threat and Vulnerability Management. Step 1.1 explains the importance of threat data in intelligence, and the intelligence sources are open source intelligence, there's proprietary source intelligence, and the key facts that you need to know about intelligence sources is the relevancy, the timeliness, and accuracy. Anything other than that, it's a fuck all. Confidence levels, it is something that you use to measure how confident you are based on the information given. And there's indicator management. So for indicator management, indicators come in different forms, such as sticks form. This is the format. This over here is the way that format is sent, and open IOC is another type of format. And for threat classifications, there's known threat and unknown threats, and there's also 0 days, such as you just got hacked and there's no patches for that. For APTs, that those are advanced persistent threats, and they're usually sponsored by nation state actors. Um, there's hacktivists, there's organized crime, there's insider trade, whether it's intentional or unintentional. And in the intelligence life cycle, the most important thing you need to remember for is over here. So for the intelligence life cycle, number one is requirements about the direction where you want to go. So let's say that we want to gather information about APT 29. We want to know how they gained their initial access. That's a requirement over there. And in order to moving on to the next one, let's move on to collection. We need to get all that information over there, and we need to analyze and process it. And after we're done analyzing and processing all that information, we could present it to the other people, such as leadership, and receive feedback. And this cycle repeats all over. One of the most pervasive is commodity malware. It is very popular, and a lot of hackers use it because you could just easily get it off the shelf. Information and sharing communities includes the healthcare, the financial sector, the aviation, the government, and critical infrastructure. The most important part is ISAC. Moving on to 1.2, given a scenario, utilize threat intelligence to support organizational securities. So the attack frameworks include MITRE framework, the diamond chain model, the diamond model of intrusion analysis locates the threat actors, and the kill chain is just imagining as if threat actors attacking you. But the MITRE is looking from a third point perspective. Threat research includes reputational, includes behavioral, and includes indicator of compromises. There's also the CVSS. For threat modeling methodologies, we need to understand the adversary capabilities. We need to understand the total attack surfaces, attack vectors, how they could attack, the impact. Like what can you do to reduce the impact? Adding an IPS would reduce the impact. The likelihood of chance of you getting exploited, and the adversary capability involves TTPs, usually the adversary's APTs. Threat intelligence sharing with supported functions. Threat intelligence, we usually share it with incident response, we share it to vulnerability management, we share it to the security engineering, and we also send it to the detection and monitoring. So, given an example, perform vulnerability management activities. So, for vulnerability identification, we first must have to identify the asset we have, and we have to do whether it's active or passive scanning, depending on the sensitivity of the device. And we also have to make sure that we're mapping and enumerating our systems itself. And we also have to validate whether the vulnerability is a true positive, it's a false positive, true negative, or false negative. And the remediation and mitigations usually are about configuration issues, patching issues, hardening, and compensating controls if we are not allowed to have one of the controls to be patched or hardened. We need to have compensating controls to do that instead. And at the very end, we need to have risk acceptance because regardless of how many uh, firewalls you put out there, there will always be a risk. That's why you have to have risk acceptance to accept how much you could accept the risk. And we have to verification of the mitigation and see if it works. So we need to get people to test on it. And scanning and perimeter criterias, we're going to be looking at risk that's associated with the scanning activities, such as the sensitivities, of a device, the vulnerability feed, oh, also sensitivity and legacy of the device. We have to look at the vulnerability feed as a way to get our information on vulnerabilities. We have to look at our scope, where we want it, what subnet, what device, what network. We need to do a credentialed and a non-credentialed scan. Credentialed scan are essentially much more accurate, whereas non-credentialed scan is looking from a far away. There's also server-based and agent-based. A server-based requires more bandwidth, whereas agent-based is requires less bandwidth, as it disaggregates less. Disaggregates more. Disaggregates less because agent-based is based on each different computer itself having that software. We also have to do scope scanning from internal and external. External, as in someone from the outside doing a scan. And for special considerations, we have to look at what type of data that we're going to be scanning. Is it private data? Is it PII data? Um, like which one's more important? We have to take priorities. We need to look at the technical constraints and the workflows, sensitivity level, IPS. Okay, so we have moving on. This one, you both agree about doing something. This one, what you promise to do, organizational governance, what your organization do to have these procedures in step. Business process interruption, will it interrupt our process? Degrading in functionality, legacy systems, and proprietary systems. 1.4, given a scenario, analyze the output from a common vulnerability assessment tools. We're going to be looking at web application scanners, such as using the OWASP, where it's essentially Burp Suite, but it's free, Burp Suite. Nikto is something similar on the command line, Arachni. They're all web application scanners. For infrastructure vulnerability scanners, we have something called Nessus, and we also have OpenVOS, and we have Qualies. All of these do vulnerability scanning on the infrastructure. And if we want to look at software assessment tools and techniques, static analysis is essentially looking at the code itself. Dynamic analysis is running the code. Reverse engineering is essentially decompiling a binary and have it back into a interpreted language. We could do something called a fuzzing, where we could input a bunch of random stuff into every output, into every input. For enumeration, we have something called nmap. hping is you could craft your TCP packets, active and passive. Passive means it's not touching the system. Active, it's touching the system. Responder, kind of like Wireshark, that's listening, but it's for Active Directory stuff. Wireless assessment tools, we got Aircrack NG, we have Reaver, which is for WPS, and we have OCL Hashcats. For cloud infrastructure assessments, we got Scout Suite, that is for multi cloud. This one, Prowler, is for AWS, and Paku's for AWS. Explain the threat and vulnerabilities associated with specialized technology. We got this one you can create yourself. This one's you have to keep in mind when making a chip. You have to keep in mind the space and power. The protocol that runs with SCADA is on Modbus. Everything else, don't need to really explain. 1.6, explain the threats and vulnerabilities associated with operating in the cloud. So the cloud service modules is software as a service, where you could have something that the provider completely manages. Platform as a service is kind of the half-half, and infrastructure as a service is you have to manage all of the infrastructure issues yourself. Platform as a service is where people provide you development tools ready for you to use and build your own stuff. There's cloud deployment modules such as the public, private, hybrid, and community. We got function as a service, where you want them to work and do something. That's where serverless architecture comes in. Infrastructure as code is essentially writing infrastructure but in code format. We want to have API where we could interact. Improper key management. people could steal your keys. If they steal it, essentially you have full access to everything. Unprotected storages, we have to encrypt it. Make sure to fully encrypt your storages. Logging and monitoring, there's insufficient and monitoring inability to access the logs. Moving on, well, given a scenario, implement controls to mitigate attacks and software vulnerabilities. There are several attack types. There is the XML attack, where it is essentially putting into an XML format and you essentially inject code. This applies same with here. Overflow attack, there's several. There's overflow, there's buffer, there's integer, and there's heap. For remote code execution, we have directory traversal, we have privilege escalation, we got password spraying, we got credential stuffing, we got impersonation. Password spraying is for any other combination of username and passwords altogether. On path attack is man in the middle. We got session hijacking, where we insert ourselves in the middle. We got rootkit, usually in memory attack, attacking the kernel mainly. We got cross-site scripting, and there's reflected, where it's just to the client. Persistent is to everyone on that site that visits that site, and the deal, I don't know what that was. But for vulnerability sides, we got the improper error handling, we got dereferencing, insecure object reference, race condition, broken authenticator sensitive. You get it. Insecure functions. This one can cause an integer overflow.